Well, as always, I'm very happy to welcome you. I'm Professor Wallace, and I'm chairman of the International Institute. Fiona once again has arranged a marvelous panel. The NATO summit ends today, so we're all thinking of issues of security, and today we're going to talk about Iran, the challenges it poses to the world, to its neighborhood, United States, to Israel and others. Fiona, you're in charge.
Okay, thank you very much, Don. Again, in the interest of time, I will be very brief. First, I would like to welcome our speakers. I'll come back to it. And as you mentioned, Don, our focus today would be on Iran security challenges, not only in the Middle East, but beyond globally. And most recently, the growing interest about the Israeli covert and overt defense strategies. So the key question now is whether we can somehow look at the future and try to figure out whether a major war, regional war, can be prevented and so on. And our speakers obviously will be able to deal with that. So just to short footnotes here, academic, as I mentioned, for logistical and technical issues, we are going to conduct the program in the following way. First, to have a pre-recorded statement by Barry Rosen. As you know, many of you know, he is a hostage, a survivor of the 1979 takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And he pre-recorded a statement in Europe. So we're going to listen to him first, and then to move on to Jerusalem and request Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, who is a former minister of congressional affairs at the Embassy of Israel in Washington. And he worked with a number of prime ministers in Israel. He will tell you about that, to provide an Israeli perspective. Then we invited, of course, our colleague from NDU, Professor Baggett, who spoke before, as well as the others, and then Ambassador Robert Hunter will join us later on. He was the former U.S. ambassador in NATO. And last but not least, our colleague, Professor Notti Santa Maria from Madrid will join us and will develop a Q&A segment. So this is the suggestion that we do have in order to encourage discussion. Also with invited colleagues in the United States and internationally. For that particular reason, logistically, we would appreciate presentations initially for 10 minutes and so on. And I may also note that all the contributors to today's Zoom forum, in their former governmental and diplomatic capacities, as well as in their current, I think, private careers, have participated in the academic programs of the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies, going all the way back decades. And I think the numerous activities, as all of us know included field research, study programs, and testimonies before Congress and parliaments and conferences, publications, and so on. So with that, I would like to ask our colleague to put on the pre-recorded statement by Barry Rosen, and obviously later on we could make any comments in regard to his participation.
Thank you, Professor Alexander, for inviting me to the ILA forum entitled Iran Security Challenges and Prospects for Conflict Resolution. It is a great pleasure. Permit me to preface my remarks with that even if one thoroughly detests the regime in Tehran, and even if Iran is evil, as George W. Bush said in his 2002 inaugural address, to say that Iran has provoked the current crisis between the US and Iran, I can only say that point of view comes from some parallel universe. The crisis was first provoked by Donald Trump, who withdrew from the US from the JCPOA, thus showing that the United States' word is not to be trusted and leading to a restart of the Iranian enrichment program, and then provoked by President Biden by his not just rejoining the JCPOA immediately on becoming president, or at any moment in the last 17 months. Those are the facts. They can be ignored for whatever reason one wants. But if the US and others find themselves in a bind with war potentially down the road, Iran is not the only one to blame. This is a geostrategic decision point. Does the United States take the JCPOA deal and focus all its energies on containing China, or does the US get sidetracked by another forever war in Iran? What I say does not go against my premise about how to deal with Iran on its human rights violation, but it's the personal contradiction that I'm confronting right now. The title of my remarks today is Lessons Learned. They will learn from my own personal experience as an American diplomat held hostage for 444 days in Iran during the heady days of the Iranian Revolution, to the more than 4 decades since, studying and actively working to raise the consciousness of policymakers and the public to the Islamic Republic's unique foreign policy tool of hostage diplomacy. I have worked with human rights organizations, writing about that phenomena, and at times dramatizing Iran's bad behavior by publicly protesting and putting my life on the line. Some of what I say today about Iran may be contextualized when speaking about other nations who exercise hostage-taking, that is, Russia, China, Venezuela, Cuba, and Syria. But I would rather that my remarks be noted as specifically related to Tehran. So, 1, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been able to succeed in perpetrating its violation of human rights, not only in domestic politics, but also internationally, because it sees one of its tools in its foreign policy toolbox, hostage diplomacy, as a success ever since it embarked on it in 1979. No matter whether it is led by the so-called hardliners or moderates, Iran carries out hostage-taking and does so knowing it is an international pariah, but yet acts as if it were the victim by the world order. 2, the act of hostage-taking is carried out by the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, in concert with the revolutionary courts and specific judges who hold closed trials, by the way, a tradition of the Pahlavi courts, that try dual nationals, whether American or European, on charges of conspiring with either the United States or Israel to overthrow the regime. It touts forced confessions and sentences innocents to years of imprisonment in the notorious maximum security prison, Evin, where victims are used as pawns in an array of political negotiations with the West. 3. The selection of victims is hard to discern, but we do know that Tehran does not recognize dual citizenship, and this means that any dual citizen visiting parents or close relatives in Iran is a potential victim. In most cases, there are no means of consular representation, leaving the hostages open to further torture and repression. The hostages first look to families, and inevitably to their naturalized host countries, whether the United States or Europe, to secure their freedom, where governments work in isolation of each other and at times act as if they are at pains in supporting their own citizens. 4. Over the last decade, hostage-taking has revolved around issues of international security, specifically the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear negotiations, and more prosaically, bilateral relations, for example, the UK's long-standing reluctance to pay the Islamic Republic back for the sale of military equipment that was never delivered. 5. Though the US and its European allies appear to express concern for hostages, their fate is regarded at best as an add-on to the nuclear file. But the United States envoy to the nuclear negotiations has admitted the connection between Iran's hostage-taking and the JCPOA when he said, "It is very hard for us to imagine getting back into the nuclear deal while innocent Americans are being held hostage." He added, "The crisis of dual nationals held hostage by the Islamic Republic has our full attention." 6. It has been a tragic mistake to only narrow U.S. focus to resolve the threat of Iran's nuclear ambitions. The hostage issue is part of that equation, and we need to see the same degree of attention and urgency that is given to the nuclear file put on the range of Iran's other malign conduct and violation of human rights. 7. The patchwork policies of Western countries have failed to stop hostage-taking. Tehran should be confronted with a multilateral effort and a comprehensive Iran policy. Should the piecemeal approach continue instead, and the hostages' fate be allowed to be kept separate from the nuclear talks, it will confirm Iranian leaders' belief that Western talk about human rights is just talk, and that there is little price to pay for Iran's hostage diplomacy. Finally, I'd like to relate what recent weeks have taught me about a go-it-alone approach when it comes to confronting a regime that plays by its own rules. It's a tale of two hostages, with that a sharp lesson in the downfall of approaching Iran's human rights abuses with anything other than complete unity, international unity. As many as 24 dual nationals, including 5 Americans and 15 Europeans, remain in captivity in Iranian prisons in total violation of international law. At the beginning of this year, I undertook a hunger strike in Vienna with the aim of convincing negotiators at the ongoing nuclear negotiations to push for a comprehensive end to Iran's hostage diplomacy. It was joined by others who took up the mantle when my body gave way, and we ultimately gained significant media attention and successfully pressured negotiators to engage with us and in some cases commit to addressing the issue. Unfortunately, however, affected nation states continued to negotiate with Iran individually, sacrificing leverage they could exert if instead they acted in diplomatic concert. They are also damaging their own standing by tacitly acknowledging Iran's deplorable use of hostage diplomacy as an acceptable tactic of international relations. Now, negotiating with Tehran on a case-by-case basis can yield some results, although more often than not, at a steep cost. The most high-profile dual national hostage of recent years, Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, was finally released in March of this year after 6 years of captivity and abuse, but only after the UK government agreed to repay almost £400 million of debt to Iran. 2 weeks ago, Ms. Ratcliffe revealed that her release was only secured after she was forced to sign a false confession by the Iranian government, a final act of humiliation that the UK Foreign Office was allegedly complicit in by encouraging her to capitulate. In the end, negotiating for the release of dual hostages on an individual basis only emboldens the regime. The latest victim of this self-reinforcing cycle is Dr. Ahmad Reza Jalali, a Swedish-Iranian disaster medicine expert who was arrested by the regime on spurious charges in 2016 and since has been sentenced to death charges of, quote, cooperation with a hostile government, i.e. Israel. Zaghari Ratcliffe's freedom was bought by the UK government on March 16, 2022. Only weeks later, Jalali nearly paid the price of Britain's decision to reward Iran's despicable behavior. Eager to punish the Swedish government for daring to host the trial of Hamid Nouri, an ex-Iranian jailer accused of playing a key role in Iran's 1988 prisoner massacre, and emboldened Tehran announced that Jalali would be executed imminently without further appeal. A provisional execution of date of May 21st was only barely staved off last month following an outcry by countless human rights advocates, but the regime is unlikely to preserve his life for much longer if Sweden does not relent. While his execution may have been postponed, Jalali has been systematically starved and tortured by prison guards and is believed by those who have had contact with him to be on the verge of death. If Tehran wants to benefit from sanctions relief, to have an opportunity to rebuild the economy it has brought to its knees through kleptocratic mismanagement, then freeing all dual national citizens currently locked away inside its prison system should be a fundamental prerequisite of the flagging negotiations in Vienna. Even with new intelligence of Iran's latest and biggest effort to build a new nuclear facility to ratchet up the nuclear threat to gain concessions, the West must present a united front in Vienna, which is the best chance of achieving our imprisoned citizens' freedom and freeing other dual nationals from the fear of future imprisonment. We owe this much to Zaghari Ratcliffe, who was forced to compromise her honor. And most of all, we owe it to Ahmad Reza Jalali for his enduring suffering. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing any responses concerning my report and my input. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Raised a lot of questions, particularly the lessons learned. And we will have an opportunity to raise them during the Q&A. Again, in the interest of time, I would like to invite our next speaker, Ambassador retired Yoram Ettinger from Jerusalem, as I mentioned before. He headed the Middle East research work of the Israeli Civil Service, and he was in charge. I would like to mention the Israel relations with U.S. Congress and so on. So academically, also, he conducted a great deal of work over the years. And I know because of logistical issues, this time is tight, but I would like to invite him to make a statement, maybe a few questions before we go ahead. Yoram?
Thank you very much. If we go back to the end of 1978, the fall of the Shah of Iran, and January 1979, before Ayatollah Khomeini took over control on February 1st, 1979, we should pay attention to the policy of the United States towards the new regime in Iran. President Jimmy Carter expressed it very lucidly when he stated 10 days before the return of Ayatollah Khomeini from exile in Paris to Tehran, when he addressed a group of global leaders in the islands of Guadeloupe. And he stated that according to the best sources of American intelligence, CIA, the world can be rest assured that Ayatollah Khomeini is going to be preoccupied with tractors, not with tanks. The US ambassador to Tehran those days, William Sullivan, sent a number of telegrams to Washington, reassuring Washington based on his own contact with sources close to Khomeini, that Khomeini is going to be an Iranian edition of Gandhi. Sadly, that was the US policy which provided tailwind to the takeover of Iran by the regime of the Ayatollahs, and literally stabbed the back of the Shah of Iran, facilitating the takeover by Khomeini by pressuring the pro-American military of Iran not to interfere, and Iran was transformed from Iran to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and from the American policemen of the Gulf to the #1 enemy of America in the Middle East, and I would venture to say beyond. We have seen that policy, which can be described by diplomatic option, sustained until this very day. The US has waived officially, formally, publicly the regime change option, the military option, and made it very clear to the apocalyptic, fanatic, rogue regime in Tehran that it's going to be limited to the diplomatic option. When you deal with a rogue regime, apocalyptic regime, by removing the military club from above the head of the rogue partner to negotiation, the question is, how badly are you going to lose? Moreover, when we examine the track record of the Ayatollah's regime since February 1979 until this very day, it has been a systematic rogue track record which has transformed Iran into the major epicenter of anti-American terrorism, subversion, civil wars against pro-American Arab Sunni regimes, and proliferation of terrorism, drug trafficking, and the proliferation of ballistic technologies and other military technologies to anti-American regimes, not limited to the Persian Gulf or the Middle East at large, way, way beyond the Horn of Africa, North Africa, West Africa, where the Ayatollahs are very well entrenched. In fact, all the way to the whole of Latin America, from southern Chile all the way to the US-Mexico border. And we have seen that by very well-documented collaboration between the Ayatollahs of Iran and every single anti-American regime in Latin America, which sadly have proliferated throughout the years, most recently Colombia has joined the ranks of the anti-American regime. For the first time, we have a left-of-center, pro-Venezuela, pro-Iran president in Colombia, which probably is going to undermine severely the American attempt to constrain Venezuela, to fight the drug cartels, to fight terrorism in Latin America. We have seen very, very strong strategic collaboration between the US and the major drug cartels in Mexico, Colombia, and Bolivia. We have seen very strong collaboration, strategic collaboration with every single terror organization in Latin America. And we have seen the Ayatollahs of Iran well entrenched in the tri-border area of Argentina and Paraguay and Brazil, the other tri-border area of Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. Those trilateral areas, as we know, have been lawless for decades and heaven, paradise for terrorists, drug traffickers, money launderers, and other rogue entities such as the Ayatollahs and their proxies, Hezbollah, the Shiite proxy, and the Sunni proxy, Hamas, which have been very well entrenched in Latin America since, in fact, the early 1980s, leveraging the substantial communities of Lebanese migrants, many of them Shiites, and while most of them obviously are peaceful people, but there is a critical mass, a sufficient number and very successful financially, which have become allies of the Ayatollahs and Hezbollah in perpetrating anti-American presence in Latin America. The focus by the Ayatollahs on Latin America, South and Central America has been driven by the very, very logical assumption that Latin America is the soft underbelly of the USA. Therefore, the strategic collaboration with those anti-American terrorist drug traffickers and elected governments in Latin America. Therefore, the exportation of the Predator unmanned aerial vehicles developed, manufactured by Iran, the exportation of them to South and Central America, the exportation or the supply of equipment to build underground tunnels to the major drug cartels, the same equipment which made it possible to construct underground tunnels between the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza, which facilitated the smuggling of ballistic systems and other advanced weaponry to Hamas in Gaza, the same equipment which has facilitated the attempts to build tunnels, construct tunnels between Lebanon and Syria and Israel for same attempts to terrorize Israel. The Ayatollahs are doing the same thing now with the drug cartels in an attempt to construct such tunnels between Mexico and the mainland in the USA. The bottom line is that there's been a systematic adherence to the diplomatic option from 1979 until today. From 79 until today, we have seen the US showering, the US and its allies in Europe showering the Ayatollahs with diplomatic and financial bonanza. And we have seen that bonanza directed not to tractors as assessed by President Carter, but towards tanks, not to butter, but to gun. And while the US has been very, very busy trying to isolate the Ayatollahs of Iran through economic sanctions, the Ayatollahs of Iran have entrenched themselves deeper and deeper in America's own backyard. Namely, the diplomatic option has proven itself to be quite an asset for the rogue, apocalyptic, anti-American Ayatollahs, and quite self-destruct as far as the US is concerned. And we're talking about quite a track record from 79 until today. Logically speaking, and it doesn't matter whether you're a hawk or a dove, Republican or Democrat, certainly logically, it doesn't make sense to persist with the same policy, which has been quite a bonanza for one of the most anti-American regime in the world, the Ayatollahs, a regime which has never been driven by despair, has never been driven by frustration, but has always been driven by a fanatic, megalomaniacal vision, which has its roots in the 7th century, which is being promoted in the Iranian education system, K through 12, which is being entrenched through the Friday sermons in the mosque, which is being reinforced by the annual commemoration of the Battle of Karbala, 680 AD, the Big Bang between the Sunnis and the Shiites. We have seen that regime adhering to that vision, which aims basically or literally to bring down every single what they call apostate Sunni regime, which aims to bring the Western world, and especially what they call the great American Satan, to submission. And this is the regime which has been treated basically until this very day as a potentially good faith negotiator. You can either be potentially good faith negotiator, or you can be that rogue regime which attempts to subvert and terrorize and bring down every single Sunni Arab regime which terrorizes and discriminates and represses all ethnic and religious minorities in Iran, which in fact has repressed women in Iran. And you can be that type of rogue regime, or you can be a potentially good faith negotiator. To assume that such a regime is potentially good faith negotiator is a classic example of self-destruct oxymoron. And to conclude, I would suggest that it's time for the US to bring out of the drawer the very constructive regime change option, military option, if it wishes to rid the Gulf, the Middle East, Latin America, the world at large from the wrath of the apocalyptic Ayatollah regime in Tehran.
Thank you very much, Yoram, for your analysis. Again, in the interest of time, I don't know if you have time now to stay longer, or
I will stay. I will stay.
You can stay. So if that's the case, you raise many questions. We'll come back to you. I would like to move on with the program and to invite our colleague, Professor Beghet from National Defense University, as I mentioned before, and he contributed to our work again. And I asked him to perhaps provide his analysis related to US and Iran, the way forward.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this very important discussion. And in the beginning, I want to make it clear that I work for United States government, for Department of Defense, but everything I will say is my own opinion and does not represent U.S. government policy or Department of Defense. Probably my take on Iranian policy is very different from my Israeli colleague. I believe in policies. There are no permanent enemies or permanent friends. And also, I do not believe Iran is a superpower, has influence in all over Latin America or all over the world. Iran is major regional power, but Iran does not have the capability to threaten the United States from Latin America or from any place else. The United States is the superpower and has the capability to deal with any threat. But also, we, United States, we tried maximum pressure on Iran, and senior official in Biden administration and many other people confirm that this maximum pressure policy failed. Failed in many ways. The Iranian economy is growing according to the World Bank and IMF. There is the Iranian government is in control, and talk about regime change like we did in Iraq is terrible idea. United States is not good at regime change, and regime change brings instability in the entire region. And again, we learn it from the example in Iraq. It is better for the people themselves to decide what they want, and for Iran, US, as I said, Iran is major regional power, and United States is major international global power. And the United States has interests in the Middle East. United States is not withdrawing from the Middle East. US interests in the Middle East includes security of Israel. US interests in the Middle East includes security of oil supplies, non-proliferation, and counter-terrorism. And United States will remain engaged in the Middle East. In the last several years, Iran has developed the capability to establish itself as major regional power and to challenge the military capabilities of its adversaries, including the United States. Basically, Iran developed what is called asymmetric warfare. Iran has invested heavily in drones, in missiles, in small, speedy boats, maritime security, cyber security, and this maximum pressure policy or arming neighboring countries is not the right way forward. The United States would like to see stability, political stability, and economic prosperity in the Middle East. The only way to get there is to get the Arabs, the Turks, the Israelis, and the Iranians to talk to each other and to together to figure out how they want to move forward and establish economic trade, diplomatic relations, and so on. President Biden will visit Saudi Arabia and meet with Arab leaders and will meet with the Israeli leaders. This shows that United States will remain engaged in the Middle East. But again, with the news about the nuclear negotiation in Doha, Qatar, did not go well, we should not give up on diplomatic negotiations. We have to accept that the Islamic Republic is here to stay. We have to forget about regime change. Again, we tried it in many countries, and the outcome was very bad for the United States and for the countries in the region. We should accept that the Islamic Republic is here to stay, and the Iranian people themselves, if they want to reform the system or any change, they will do it without foreign intervention, without American intervention. We should urge our allies, Arabs, Israelis, and Turkey to integrate Iran in the regional system. Iran is not isolated in any way. Iran has friends in the Gulf, Oman and Qatar, and Iran is talking to the Saudis, talks sponsored by the Iraqi government. The United States should support regional integration, and it should be bottom-up approach, not imposed by foreign power. And we should encourage the Israelis and the Iranian to de-escalate. Again, the future, there is no doubt in my mind that the Arabs, the Israelis, the Turks, and the Iranians have always shared the Middle East, have always lived side by side, and all of them will remain neighbors, will continue to be neighbors, and the United States should support peaceful negotiation, creating a new Middle East where all these four peoples and other minorities learn to live together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your analysis. Obviously, we'll come back to some of the issues that you have raised during the Q&A discussion. I would like to move to our next speaker, Ambassador Robert Hunter, who is cordially invited to present his views. And as many of you know, he worked for a number of U.S. presidents as well as in the White House. And we are grateful for his participation to make an initial statement of some 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to the Q&A discussion. Bob?
Thank you, Yona. It is always a privilege to be involved in your sessions because they genuinely bring together a lot of different perspectives and go to the heart of the issues. This slot should have been occupied by my wife, Shireen Hunter, who's the brains of the family, but I had COVID early, she had COVID late. I've gotten over it, she hasn't. So she's asked me if I would fill in to the extent I can. Okay, I want to build on what Professor Bhagat said in terms of the overall geopolitics and where one needs to be, if at all possible, for the long term in the Middle East. But I'm going to focus on U.S. interests. My background, where I've had a record of that, I was the author of the Carter Doctrine, for example, in Jimmy Carter's White House, and I've been involved in these issues now since the mid-1970s, off and on. One thing about the Middle East, once you get into them, you never get out of them. It's a lifetime occupation. You're never unemployed. Okay, the United States has several interests in regard to this region. Number one is no bombs, if possible, by anybody in the Persian Gulf region. And that, of course, begins with Iran, which is the closest. We also have some other major interests, one of which is to preserve the security of the State of Israel. That goes way back, even before Israel was created. And I've been working on these issues since June the 6th, 1967, when the Six-Day War began. And that is not just something which is a strategic issue, it's something that goes to the heart of the being of the people of the United States. And that is unimpeachable, the support to the security of Israel. It does not mean, however, that we will necessarily adopt every position that Israel has or every interpretation, even if it's own security, if that implies our doing certain kinds of things, which in the United States with various governments believe are not necessarily consonant with where we need to be. Of course, we have other interests as well. Terrorism, very important. The United States talks about it all the time. The NATO alliance in Madrid this week talked about it, including Middle East terrorism, of which Iran has been a participant, but it's not just Iran. At least up until the hopefulness that's being expressed by the President Biden's meetings in Saudi Arabia, the leading terrorist regime in the Middle East in terms of promoting it has been Saudi Arabia. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Most Middle East-born terrorism is Sunni. It's been backed by the Saudis with money and inspiration, all over the place. And if you want to deal with terrorism, it's not just getting Iran to stop what it's doing; it's to getting Saudi Arabia and there are some other elements of the Persian Gulf involved to stop it. And I hope that that is something that Mr. Biden makes absolutely clear to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. We've suffered too long from that. An awful lot of Americans and others have died because of Saudi Arabia. Some Americans have died because of Iran, has already been pointed out. So that's another thing. Of course, the flow of oil, but I haven't been involved in that since 1973. I guess, God, I'm getting older and older. There's a basic rule. Every country that has oil is going to sell it, full stop. All right, now, we came down to the Obama administration, which made a Herculean effort to try to deal with the problem of the Iranian bomb. And that led to the negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, successfully. It was, in some aspects, term limited, but that was, at the time, a lot of years. It's obviously fewer years now. There was a lot of controversy over it, including in the United States Congress. It's one reason it's not a treaty. It's an agreement among a number of countries, of which the United States and Iran are the principal ones, but also includes the three Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, and the European Union kind of sitting there on the side. Unfortunately, neither Iran nor the United States did the things they needed to do in order to use the JCPOA as a means potentially, I don't want to go beyond that, potentially, to change the nature of relationship and then change the nature of the behavior of this particular regime, which I have no time for, and I don't know any Americans who really do have any time for it. The Iran, even though the ballistic missile program of Iran is contained in the agreement and in the UN Security Council resolution as something that needed to be done, but it was not a requirement in the actual language. The United States, for its part, unfortunately, the very day after the JCPOA went into effect, the United States Treasury imposed new restrictions on Iran, new sanctions. So you can say that neither side built a lot of trust based upon that. Now we move forward. Incidentally, this agreement was fought by a number of America's friends and partners in the region. Saudi Arabia fought it, UAE fought it, and Israel fought it intensely, including its prime minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, the once and maybe future prime minister. But for Yoram Ettinger. You're the one that's going to have to decide that, not me. It's not our business who governs Israel. Went as far as to speak to a joint session of the United States Congress and asked members of the Congress to be loyal to the state of Israel and not loyal to the United States president. That's never happened before, but that's another matter. Okay, President Trump, for whatever reason, decided to pull the United States out of the JCPOA in 2018, and Iran did the same. That meant, from our perspective, that instead of continuation of progress, of in effect dismantling most of the Iranian program that had military applications, including the getting rid of their nuclear reactor and outsourcing most of their more highly enriched uranium. The Iranians went back into that business. We lost. And I would argue everybody lost by that. I'll let the Israelis decide for themselves whether they lost from it. American interpreters, many of us would say, this could not possibly have been a good thing for Israel to increase the risks of an Iranian bomb against Israel, or increase the risk of a need for Israel, with or without the United States, to attack Iranian nuclear facilities, with all the imponderables that are involved in it. And there would be incredible imponderables. The idea of a surgical military operation in Iran, well, maybe yes, maybe no, but we have to look at what happened in Afghanistan and what happened in Iraq. One has to be a little careful making those judgments. Now, obviously, at that point, there were no benefits in regard to what else Iran was doing, including in Yemen, though Saudi Arabia was the prime instigator of that. Everybody knows that, because when I was in the White House in 1979, we were having to deal with Saudi incursions into Yemen, and it goes all the way back to the Nasser period. So that's been a long-standing ambition. Of course, the Iranians have ambitions. And in Syria, where if I were an Israeli, I would indeed be deeply worried, and they are. I'm not going to answer for them. That's their concern. And in regard to Hezbollah, and regard to Hamas, though our people judge that the Hamas problem is less with regard to Iran than it is with some others, but still a problem. Okay. Biden comes in and had a chance on day one, as he did with so many other policies by President Trump, that President Biden judged were not in the best interest of the United States, things done by executive order. He reversed, did it immediately. He didn't do that with the JCPOA. In effect, he continued with the policies that were put forward by the former Secretary of State, the 12-point program, which, if it were implemented, that is regime change. That's no country could take that seriously. That was just thrown out there and made things worse and helped to justify what Trump did. Okay, so the idea was, as Biden said during the campaign, and his campaign people who are now in office said, okay, why do we have compliance for compliance? Well, except that wasn't the initial position of the Biden administration. It was, that's fine, provided Iran moves first. Well, that wasn't going to happen. In fact, many people, and I'm one of them, argued that if indeed Biden had simply rejoined the JCPOA, taking us back to where we were with Obama, who paid heavy political price for doing it, and frankly helped everybody in the region, including Israel, in our judgment, strung it out, got into a negotiating process, supposedly done at arm's length, and failed to reap any benefits. For example, Biden could have said Actually, he could still do it today. He could do it this afternoon if he wanted to, despite all this. Negotiations are going on. That's what these people get paid for, and that's what diplomats do. That's their job. He could have then said to the Iranians, "We will take off the sanctions that were imposed and removed earlier pursuant to the JCPOA. Now, you have to go back to where you were when the JCPOA was in force. And you either do it or you don't." And if the Iranians did it, then one could move on from then and try to build things dealing with other elements of Iranian behavior and overall Persian Gulf requirements. And if the Iranians didn't do it, you could have snapback, but at least it could have been tested. But there were elements within the administration and on Capitol Hill that refused to do that, to give Mr. Biden running room. And our friends in the Middle East and partners have hammered at us consistently since then not to do that. And in fact, those of us who are experienced negotiators don't see that the Iranians have really operated in good faith. But to be in good faith, the United States hasn't either. As I say, there was a very simple thing to do, which is just rejoin the JCPOA and then proceed from there. So we are now in a situation where the chances of conflict have gone up. The chances of resolution have gone down. Both sides have dug in their heels. Maybe there'll be an agreement, maybe there won't. As I say, there didn't have to be all this stuff. The United States could act unilaterally. Just do it. Forget about the IRGC and what Iran is demanding on. Just do the rejoining the JCPOA, remove those sanctions that are related to it, and then challenge the Iranians to do something. But in part because of U.S. domestic politics, mostly because of U.S. domestic politics, which are heavily influenced from abroad, heavily influenced. One won't say decisively, but certainly without the foreign influence, it would be a different picture. So that's what I'm calling for. Now, where do we go from here? If we do get an agreement, then we have to have some serious conversations with everybody about building some kind of security situation for the future, in which Professor Bhagat was talking about, in which everybody has a stake. You can't build a security structure leaving anybody out. That includes Israel, includes Turkey, includes Egypt, certainly includes all the Arab states, and it will include Iran. We're not even there yet until we can get this matter of the JCPOA done. And that ball is in both countries' part, but unilaterally, the President of the United States could take care of it. And incidentally, let me give you a sidebar why this is so erroneous in my judgment. Right now, we're worried about the war in Ukraine. We're imposing sanctions on Russia. One of the things that's causing a real problem in the West is inflation, much of which is based upon sanctions against Russia, including in the oil sector. Maybe that some economists say it's not true, but certainly that's the perception throughout Western Europe. And yet the United States is unwilling to remove sanctions on Iranian oil exports beyond what it does to China and that sort of thing, which could happen if we rejoin the JCPOA. We don't even talk about it, which would help us with the Europeans to help keep sanctions in place, which whatever you heard out of the G7 or whatever you heard out of NATO summit is unraveling. This is a very short-term unified confrontation against Russia. It's unraveling, and Mr. Putin is outweighing us. So that's another area in which a linkage between two regimes, two parts of the world, the United States is in default of American interests.
Thank you very much, Bob, for your presentation. Obviously, we'll get back to some of your questions and issues that you raised. And again, in the interest of time, if we may move on to Our last speaker who is going to focus on nuclear issues as assessed by the European Union and the International Atomic Energy Agency, Professor Santa Maria from Madrid.
Hello to everyone. Professor Alexander, Professor Wallace, very nice to meet you again. And good afternoon to all of you. I think I have prepared a little presentation and I will need the help of Roger for helping me to move on the slides. Actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about nuclear issues assessed by the European Union and the International Atomic Energy Agency. Next slide, please. Okay, very fast, we can go a little bit on the Iran nuclear program, the origins. Iran joined the nuclear programs in 1950s after the program of President Eisenhower, 1953, of Atoms for Peace, to make nuclear energy available for all the countries. And by that time, Iran was ally of the United States, and they planned that Iran could have, by the end of the 20th century, 23 nuclear power plants to supply electricity to the country. The case is that the evolution of events went in such a way that in 1979, the regime of the Shah Pahlavi fell down and started the revolution, the Islamic revolution of Ayatollah Khomeini. During that period, from 1979, the next 10-15 years were very difficult to find stability. They have a long war with Iraq, the Iraq-Iran war from 1990 to 1988, and the regime, the Iranian regime, was rather weakened. The years passed, and the post-revolution period, they were stabilizing the scientific field. It's important to say that thousands of scientists fled during the Islamic revolution to the West, in a big number of them, nuclear scientists that have been working for the nuclear power plants that were planned. Actually, in 1974, it was created the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, whose obligations are, as you can see in the slide, the design, construction, and operation of nuclear power plants, nuclear fuel cycle, construction of research reactors, both fission and fusion types, research activity for the development of irradiation application, and monitoring of safely conducted nuclear activity in the country through the Iran Nuclear Regulatory Authority, INRA. This organism is rather strong in terms of having been working for years and years in many fields, in many application fields of nuclear science. Please, next slide. Yeah, okay, this is a very, very big panoramic, and all of you know how is present situation in terms of facilities, in terms of installation. We've got in blue central, the central of Bushehr, which is just in the Gulf, in the zone of the Gulf, is the one blue. It is the first with one reactor presently operative. They are working to construct another unit that will be ready probably for 2026 and so on. Afterwards, we have in red enriching uranium plants in Natanz and in Fordov, and the extraction of uranium in several mines, as in Sarkhand and in Chile. And the Ardalan is where they produce the concentration of uranium, which is called popularly as yellow cake. They have several reactors for research, as we have seen in Iraq, and the main ones are in the University of Tehran. Maybe next slide, we can see, this is the present Bushehr plant. The Bushehr plant was planning to be built during the 70s, but due to the several crises that the country lived, it was stopped. And finally, there were some agreements with the Russian Federation to finish the construction of the power plant, which is presently working, producing electricity since 2013, I think, 2013, more or less. In the next slide, we will see after the controversial problems, because it seemed in 2003, US satellites detected some plans for enriching of uranium, and afterwards in 2003, Iran recognized that the plant of Natanz was used for enriching of uranium, and after several controversies and not stable relationship, no good or excellent diplomatic relationship. Finally, in 2015, it was agreed to find a joint comprehensive plan of action that was signed between the P5 countries that you know are the permanent members of the United Nations, nuclear states actually, plus Germany and the European Union. According to this very important agreement, Iran will allow the inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency to monitor or its civil centers. It will rely on light water reactors, not heavy water reactors. It will keep the enriching capacity. It will lower to a total of 3.67, which is the enrichment required for producing electricity. As you know, to produce nuclear bombs, the enriching should be until 93% of U35. Iran will redesign as well, according to the agreement, the modernized water reactors in Iraq, and finally will continue manufacturing the centrifuge machine for the purposes specified in the agreement. According to this agreement, the United Nations finished the sanctions that were imposed to Iran by that period. But in May 2018, the United States administration withdrew from the joint agreement and reimposed sanctions again on Iran. This is present situation. Next slide, maybe we can see actually how useful was being this joint comprehensive plan of action according to verification and according to inspection of the Atomic International Energy Agency. I don't know, Jordan, if it would be possible to have this slide bigger, because otherwise maybe it's not possible to, I don't know if you can see it well. It is written in different, I have included it the slide because it is very visual. It's written with numbers, and it says how it has been improving, the different verifications, how the surveillance by cameras have been installed, how people involved in the verification and inspection of the nuclear plant in Iran has been increasing from 2015 until 2017, 18 more or less. The next slide we'll find as well different steps given because, as you know, Iran signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. In 1997, it implemented, and it signed it in 1955. In 1995, the Non-Proliferation Treaty for indefinitely. Here we've got the different steps given and how the situation changed a little as the United States left, or the United States administration left or withdrew the plan, because as we can see in the next slide, there is a concern about security in terms of nuclear physical security in the Middle East from the European Union Commission. First of all, the European Union Commission accepted in very well grade the harmonization with the nuclear deal. Actually, it started cooperation projects with Iran, the first one from 2018 to 2020 to support the Iran Nuclear Regulatory Agency in designing and equipping emergency preparedness and response. On April 7, 2022, 4 months ago, the European Union completes as well the first phase of cooperation with the Iran Nuclear Regulatory Authority. And in the program, which goes from 2021 to 2027, the European Instrument for International Nuclear Safety Cooperation, there is a section devoted to the Middle East region, and one part especially devoted to the program that will contribute to the implementation of the European Union commitments and the Annex 3 on civil nuclear operation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Why this instrument? Because according to the next slide, we can see that there is several programs to develop nuclear energy in the Middle East, okay? First of all, Turkey probably will have operative its first nuclear power plant, Akuyu, by 2026. In Iran, the nuclear power plant of Bushehr 2 will be probably ready in 2025 for the production. We've got as well in Saudi Arabia, these two other nuclear power plants, and in Jordan, which wants as well the Jordan government to develop nuclear energy to install and to improve electricity connections, and especially all these countries to use nuclear energy for desalinization. Desalinization is a very expensive requires a lot of energy and is very costly to desalinize water. And we are living in the Middle East. We have the saltiest seas in the world. We have the Dead Sea, and the volume of salinization is very high. For this reason, the desalinization of this sea is much more expensive than in other places of the world. This is one of the reasons of why this instrument is being applied, because according to this, and the next slide, we will see that in the Middle East should be a prioritization of nuclear security, because we've got several threats and challenges. We've got, as you know, and you have been telling this afternoon, geopolitical tension, non-state actor, terrorist networks, hybrid conflicts, illicit radioactive and nuclear materials trafficking, the problem of nuclear proliferation, etc., etc. We have to counteract all these threats and challenges by effective monitoring nuclear facilities, by having an accounting control of the nuclear material, emphasizing the defense in depth security, and naturally to create a nuclear culture that permits people to know, or to be able, or to be aware of knowing what are we talking about, and natural, international, and regional cooperation. And in the next slide, we will see the concerns of the European Union. The European Union considers that the relationship with Iran should be multilateralist in terms of cooperate not only as individual countries, but as well as the whole that implies the European Union Commission. For this reason, according to the High Representative, and I have written it literally, they consider that presently the treaty, the nuclear deal, is under great pressure on multiple fronts, and he thinks that this plan of action should be preserved for two reasons. The first one, because it took many years to get to this agreement. It says as well that it's a prime example of what European diplomacy and effective multilateralism can achieve. And the second, because according to the European Union, this joint agreement is not merely a symbolic success. It has given results. It has given important steps have been given since their signing, and for this reason, this is one of the reasons, or the many reasons, to try to keep it working on. The next slide, please, is a group of former European Union officials recently sent a letter to the ministry in Iran to ask him that they wish to express that their concern about the negotiation, that they would like to restore the Iranian compliance with the country, with Iranian government and the United States government to go back to negotiations, because they are worried that the JCPOA has entered in a situation of non-movement, and they consider that is crucial for international peace and security. And my last slide is just related in two sentences, and I would like to add a third one. The first sentence I wrote, European Union and the organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency, are main actors interested in a prompt solution to save the Iran nuclear deal. Secondly, a regression to initial tensions is feared, which could conduct to a dangerous situation in the looking for peace and stability in the Middle East. And third one, reading the paper that Professor Alexander Gladwinter, the ILI, has prepared for us, one of the questions is, can a major regional war be prevented? I agree with Professor Gaudat. I think that it can be prevented. It's necessary to go back to negotiations, and it's necessary to clarify the situation for the good of all of us. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nati, again. And now I would like to suggest that we move on to the Q&A discussion first among the speakers, the panelists, and then to open it up to the invited, I think, colleagues, as well as selected attendees from the US and internationally. So first, of course, Barry Rosen cannot respond at this time, but any comments related to his statement in connection with violations of human rights and so on, and he would respond subsequently. But first, I think we are going to ask Yoram Ettinger from Jerusalem to make any comments to the other presentations.
Well, the first comment I would like to make is that when I hear references to getting together and bring about a kumbaya-like state of mind among Middle Eastern rival elements, the Iranian Shiites and the Sunni Arab neighbors in the Middle East, to bring them with Turkey along and produce peaceful coexistence. It reminds me of an old country western song. I don't know if participants here are familiar with country western songs, but there was a major country western singer, George Strait, and one of his hits was, "I've got some oceanfront property in Arizona, and if you'll buy that, I'll throw the Golden Gate in for free." This is exactly the Ayatollah's tactics, which has misled and trapped President Carter and his team, Zbigniew Brzezinski, although he was more hawkish than the State Department establishment, the CIA, the Pentagon, and they all fell for Ayatollah Khomeini peaceful songs that he is inherently anti-communist and anti-Soviets, and therefore he would accommodate the Americans, and certainly he had no interest in the exportation of the Islamic Revolution. He supposedly would be only preoccupied with bringing domestically liberty and enhanced standard of living, all of which had absolutely nothing to do with reality. Anyone who took Middle East 101 should have read the writing on the wall. It was not only written on the wall, it was written with font 44 or font 60, namely Ayatollah Khomeini by definition, as are his successors, are committed to this fanatic, apocalyptic vision of taking over the Gulf, taking over the Middle East, global aspirations, and establish a universal Shiite community. It sounds very illogical to us in the West. but this is exactly the reality according to the Ayatollahs until this very day. There has been an ongoing attempt, as we heard also during this Zoom session, an attempt by Westerners to try and export Western values, Western institutions to the Arab, Muslim Middle East. It's similar to persons who are determined to force a river to run from the ocean all the way to the mountain top. I wish it would be possible, but we better be realistic. And when we talk about realism, part of that realism has been the Iranian nuclear archives, which were seized by Israeli Mossad. Some of it was released publicly. All of it has been shared with the American intelligence community, and it shows in a well-documented manner. They never intended to comply with the JCPOA. They never complied with the JCPOA. They never intended to allow the inspectors to inspect, and it was all wrapped with what I would call screensavers which have attracted the Western world, especially the European part of the Western world, due to the genuine eagerness to produce peace. Sadly, this is not what most of the world believes in. This is certainly not what the Ayatollahs of Iran aim at. And last and not least, we have had track record. And when I hear about the expectations and the attempt to apply moral equivalence between the US and the Ayatollahs, well, the US made some mistakes, Ayatollah made some mistakes. Yes, some people drive through red light. Other people happen to be involved in mass executions and horrendous violation of human rights and terrorism. You cannot apply moral equivalence to those two cases. And in order to project and to assess intelligently future behavior by the Ayatollahs, I know of no better way than relying on their track record. Past track record, especially if it's systematic, since 79 until July 2022, this track record is the best way to assess the future. And that record tells us very, very simply, leopards, sometimes they change tactics, but they cannot change stripes, and the same thing apply to the Ayatollah leopards.
Okay, well, Yoram, I would like to invite the other colleagues first to make their comments, and we'll continue with the discussion. Is Professor Baget still there?
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
would you kindly, I don't know if you heard the latest comment.
Thank you. And I believe that the bottom line, all of us would like to see peace in the Middle East, but we have some disagreement how to do it. And as American, and I believe United States is very interested in peace, not only in the Middle East, but around the world, because it is good for United States and it is also in line with our values. And I still have family in Egypt and have dear friends in Israel and in many other Middle Eastern countries. Personally and professionally, I would love to see peace. But also, I believe we should not keep talking about the past and look how to make the future better. My Israeli colleague keeps talking about Ayatollah Khomeini, and he died many years ago, and somehow it reminds me every time US diplomats meet with Iranian diplomats, the Iranians keep talking about 1953 and history, and it is very important to focus on the future, how to make it better for everybody. The Iranians are not motivated, are not driven by ideology, Shia. No political system, no government can stay in power if it does not meet the economic needs of its people. The Iranian people, like the Israeli people, like the Arabs, the Turks, the Americans, would like to see jobs, would like to put food on the table, would like to take care of their families. This is what the Iranian policy is driven by. It is not driven by Shiism or ideology or 7th century. I mean, we have to be realistic and talk about the future. And about nuclear weapons, nobody would like to see a proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I understand Israel cannot give up this nuclear option now. There are many good reasons, but there have been efforts to make the Middle East a nuclear weapon-free zone. 1974, Egypt and Iran called for making the Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone. My strong belief is, as long as there is double standard, as long as Israel has monopoly over nuclear weapons, the Arabs, the Iranians, and the Turks will try to change this somehow, either by trying to make their own nuclear weapons or by trying to invest in chemical, biological weapons. But there is double standard, and the efforts to make the Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone have failed, and we should not give up on these efforts. Finally, about human rights, yes, there is violation of human rights in Iran, but also there is violation of human rights here in the United States, in Israel. The killing of American Palestinian journalist was a clear violation of human rights. We all have a long way to go, and we should try to work together to improve human rights every place in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move on. Ambassador Bob Unter, please.
Just very briefly. I don't know anybody in the business in the United States who's trying to do something sensible in American interests, and frankly, in the interests of some of our partners, including in Israel, where we are the dominant supporter of Israel from outside, who is Pollyannish about this. The recognition is that there are power relationships. Some of it may be ideological, religious, apocalyptic. Though we do notice that in the years that the Ayatollah and his gang tried to spread his notion, their notion of Shiism throughout all the Shia communities in Central Asia, it didn't work. People didn't want it. They didn't want what the Iranian model had to offer. That's years ago. Let me go back to my own years as being a negotiator for Arab Israeli members. When Prime Minister Begin was in office, and I worked for Jimmy Carter, after Camp David and immediately after the conclusion of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, and we worked on autonomy and other matters. It was always with an idea that if there was something to be agreed, it had to be, if not self-enforcing, but enforceable. And one did not ask anybody to take things on faith, certainly not to ask Israel to take anything on faith. If there was going to be something that would happen, it would have to be because there were arrangements, fully effective arrangements, so that for its part, Israel would feel secure with whatever it was doing. Similarly, if we're going to have a JCPOA, which was worked out long and hard by an awful lot of people, including a lot of people who had very close ties to Israel, as some of us have had over the years. It was to make sure that whatever was in there was going to work for the United States, but also for partners in the region, primarily Israel. Okay? And anything that happens in the future, if we're able, for example, to get back to the JCPOA and to build things beyond it, or to try to build things beyond it, it has to be based on facts of power. It has to be based on relationships of power. It has to be based on self-interest and the capacity to devise things with outside help, perhaps, maybe not. So nothing in Arab-Israeli relations, if we go back and look at that, ever happened without outside intervention. The one time it was not the United States, it was my good friend Johan Jürgen Holst from Norway, who did the Oslo course. It's going to have to be with arrangements that are going to provide for the security, beginning of the United States and then of our partners, and recognize also that Iran too has faced security threats from abroad. It's not unique in being free of security threats. Happens all the time. It was the country that was invaded in, let me get the dates right, 1980 by Iraq, a war that went on for 8 years, which was supported in significant part by the United States. I'd left the government by then, but I certainly was engaged in a number of things where I saw what was going on. In fact, it is remarkable, leave aside 1953, and leave aside the American view, which Mary Rosen put forward, of the hostage crisis, which is poisons relations on both sides. It's remarkable that we're able to deal with the Iranians at all after what we did with Saddam Hussein, as we were an active backer of his until he got into his head to go into Kuwait. So if there's something going to work for the future, it's going to have to be based on realities, power realities, enforced or enforceable power realities, not upon, to use Ron Mittinger's words, kumbaya. Incidentally, I had the honor of working with Spivak Via very closely, who was one of his predecessors there, and also with a number of other senior Israeli politicians and negotiators over the years. And I have not had the honor of meeting Mr. Ettinger. Perhaps it will happen at some point.
Thank you very much, Bob, and we would like to invite Professor Santamaria again on the nuclear issue, the broader, not only the regional in terms of the Iranian perspective, but broader and the implications of the Russian-Ukrainian experience so far.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I think that I would like to say something to Ambassador Ettinger related with the figures of the JCPOA. Since the first General Director, Mohammed El-Baradei, after Mr. Yukiya Amano and present Mr. Grossi, the verification and following of nuclear power plants in Iran has been a reality. And it's a reality, are empiric facts that Iran has been following the rules or the regulations that had admitted to follow when signed the JCPOA in 2015. Therefore, these are facts. It's not just this is proven facts. So I want to say that because it is important to see the steps given. Last week, for example, in Doha, as all of you know, it was a meeting between some representatives of the United States and the Minister of Foreign Office of Iranian Foreign Office, Mr. Abdullahian. They met in Doha, and they have a meeting. And according to the European Union observers, the meeting was good, but probably they are ahead still a lot of things to solve. Something is true, which is according to what Professor Alexander said. We have now a new big front open, which is Ukraine, the war of Ukraine. The war of Ukraine is becoming a factor of worriness as well, to be added to the destabilization that is presently leaving the Middle East. We have Syria, we have Iraq, we have the big crisis in Lebanon, we have the war in South Yemen. So I think that there are too many open fronts to continue looking for more open fronts. In case of uranium, it's true that Russia and China, especially Russia, is the main ally for Iran in supplying technology or the material needs. But I don't think that the war with Ukraine will have any special influence in this aspect. What we have to look for is to get really to try to find the right way for going back to negotiations and to avoid that the nuclear Iran crisis goes deeper, because we don't need a Middle East with more problems and with more instability. No, none of us. The war is very close. We are in the middle in the European Union with absorbing all these problems, absorbing all these threats. And I think that it's just a question of goodwill for both sides.
Thank you very much, Nati. At this time, I would like to invite our colleague, Professor Don Wallace, who lived and worked in the Middle East for many, many years. So perhaps you could make a comment or question at this time.
Thank you very much, Yona. And once again, you've provided a rather energetic panel. You know, I only three reflections. One, picking up on Professor Bhagat, Iran and the Iranian people are here to stay. I don't think we should forget that. Now, I understand that an Islamic regime is different from a non-Islamic regime, but I just make the basic point. Iran and its people, not only they're here to stay, they've been here for thousands of years. And it's just an unavoidable fact. Second, I'm a little puzzled in three respects. One, facts, I'll come back to that. What should be our policy? And the third point is this, given the situation with respect to the world's climate, we're stuck with nuclear energy, whether we like it or not. And I think that's something to keep in mind. On the facts, Ambassador Ettinger, I listened to him very carefully. It seems to me if Iran is here to stay and we believe that its aims are malignant, it seems to me the only answer is either war or continued irregular operations by Israel. That's certainly a possibility, and I think most of the other participants have a slightly different view, and Ambassador Ettinger may be correct that they are naive, but listening to him very carefully. I remember I heard the defense of the JCPOA years ago from various Americans. Very few people embraced it. They just thought it was the least worst possibility. And that was certainly my view. It was interesting that Mr. Rosen, who'd been a prisoner of the Iranians, was quick to blame President Trump as well. Now, I would not make the mistake, and I think Ambassador Ettinger is right. I don't think there's any moral equivalence between Trump, as horrendous as he is, in my view, and his sort of idiosyncratic actions on the one hand, and the sustained activity of the Iranians. I think it would be a mistake to equate them. But I think what we're stuck with is this. I think Iran and its people are here to stay, and the U.S. has to determine what's in our security interest. And I think to suggest that it's merely war or Iranian irregular Israeli activities, I just don't think that is a satisfactory way to go forward. But I would say that the discussion has been so excellent that I honestly don't know what the answer is. I'm looking at Ambassador Hunter, but I'll step back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. Now, If I may, I would like to check and see whether some of our distinguished colleagues in the US or abroad, or some invited attendees, have a question or comment.
Well, there was one question which was posted on a Q&A, and one which came by the chat, and I think they're interrelated. The first one was that in the news, there was a report that Iran and Argentina applied to join BRICS. And the second question by chat is that Russia was very vital in the JCPOA deal that they mediated with Iran. So having these two facts, how does it affect the possible deal with Iran while Russia is being essentially attempted to be isolated?
Is there anyone who would like to respond to that?
Sure, I'll say a few words, and then others I'm sure will have more to say. Russia now, in terms of its standoff with us, and that's another subject for another day, how that came about, where it's going, what we need to do, clearly is looking for other things to do in the world to regain some status as a major power, if not a great power, and certainly never again a superpower. And that includes what it does in the Middle East, includes what it does in Syria, for example. Even though in Syria, as far as I know, the Russian Air Force and the United States Air Force continue to exchange the data that's necessary so they don't shoot one another down. But the Russians and Iranians are clearly engaged in some kind of dance here to see whether either of them, on their own interest, are able to use the relationship with the other for their particular interests. We already know, of course, that Iran is exporting a good deal of its hydrocarbons to China. It won't have a need to import hydrocarbons from Russia, but it could want to import other kinds of things. And that, of course, has gone back and forth for decades. So I think one has to think about what Russia will be up to elsewhere in the world and in the Middle East as we look to just this kind of narrow little perspective we've been considering here.
Okay.
If-
Yeah, go ahead.
If I may, as I said before, United States is not withdrawing from the Middle East, but also at one point, the United States was a dominant power in the Middle East. Not anymore. There is some kind of competition between the United States, China, and Russia. And in the United States, we are evaluating this competition and how we can get our allies to keep working with us, not only Arab countries, but also Israel. Many American diplomats talk to their Israeli counterparts about China building naval presence in Haifa. And we are also talking to our Arab allies about China building IT, information technology infrastructure, and competing with American companies. And this competition is very important, and there is perception, rightly or wrongly, that there is a new world order. This new world order means that the United States is not the only superpower. There are other players. China is the main trade partner to many countries, including in the Middle East. And the United States still is the main security partner, but probably some countries will reconsider their policy should they keep United States as their main security partner and China as the main trade partner. But probably the point I'm trying to make here is there is perception, rightly or wrongly, that there is emerging new world order where United States is not the only global power. There is China, and probably for Russia, much will depend on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fine. Let me ask Yoram perhaps to enlighten us in terms of how do you see the short-term development in light of the Israeli upcoming elections in terms of its policy vis-a-vis Iran. Do you see any opportunities for diplomacy to engage with the Iranians and other partners in the Middle East?
One of the very too few common denominators in Israel between left and right, between the pro-Netanyahu, anti-Netanyahu, one of the very few common denominators is the attitude towards Iran's ayatollahs and a consensus, barring some very, very small fringes. The consensus is that negotiations are the worst way of dealing with the real clear danger of Iran's ayatollahs. And again, not real and clear danger to Israel alone or mostly Israel, but real and clear danger mostly to the pro-American Sunni Arab countries and in fact to the so-called Great American Satan itself. My own concern, as you may have guessed from my previous comments, is not with the Israeli policy, but rather with the American policy. One of the underlying assumptions behind the monopoly accorded by the foreign policy establishment in Washington, mostly Secretary of State Blinken, who is, in my mind, the chief architect of President Biden's national security and foreign policy. One of the cardinal elements behind it is the assumption that an introduction of military option would inflame the reality in the Middle East and US-Iranian relations. And that, in my mind, is similar to a police chief who decides to waive or to take out the club from above the head of the local violators of human rights and law and order and make it known in the neighborhood that from now on it's only negotiation between the police and the mobsters, drug traffickers in the area. It would not bode well for the communities in that area. Exactly the same thing applies dealing with rogue regimes. And again, not rogue regime by speculations, rogue regime by well-documented track record, as I said before, since February 1st, 1979, it has become worse and worse and worse as far as the rogue attitude. I keep hearing the expectations, the hopes, and I have no doubt all those hopes are driven by benevolent ideas and benevolent assumptions. But I'm reminded, in fact, Ambassador Hunter talked here about Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was taken amazingly enough, and recklessly enough by the American foreign policy establishment as an ally, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I mean, how gullible can anyone be to assume that the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Because the enemy of my enemy can also be my own enemy, certainly in the case of Saddam Hussein and the USA. And as we all know, literally until the day of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, the State Department was in the opinion that this is an intra-Arab affairs. This is none of the American business. How self-destructive can such policy be? We remember the attitude towards Bashar Assad when he took over, the attitude expressed by the so-called wise men of Foggy Bottom, the State Department, by the so-called elite media, especially Tom Friedman of the New York Times and his like in the Washington Post, LA Times, CNN, NPR, etc. They approach Bashar Assad as a potentially moderate leader because of his background in London and being married to a British woman and speaking so many foreign languages and being the president of the Syrian Internet Society. And lo and behold, reality was very different, and it was not a mystery. It was known. And the same thing had to do with Yasser Arafat, who was embraced by the Western world, I'm ashamed to say, by Israeli leaders as well. And there was absolutely no real reason to embrace Arafat, unless, as happens to be the case too frequently, Western policymakers decide, due to their eagerness to produce peace and peaceful coexistence, to sacrifice the frustrating, inconvenient, intolerant, violent reality on the altar of Pollyannish visions and wishful thinking, and therefore Arafat received the Nobel Prize for Peace. I mean, people don't even realize how far you can go being swept by wishful thinking and being so frustrated with reality. It's true that military option in the attempt to literally free the Iranian people from the Ayatollahs, and nobody talks about ignoring the Iranian people. But as people here know, the vast majority of the Iranian people do not want the Ayatollahs. They are repressed, they are tortured, they are hung by the Ayatollahs. And certainly, when we talk about the cost of that, yes, there may be some severe cost. I happen to think that the military might certainly of the US combined with Israel is no match for Iran. It's like matching NBA team with a junior high school basketball team. But let's assume I'm wrong. And indeed, it's going to be severe cost. Isn't it logical to conclude that as severe cost as it may be, it's going to be dwarfed by facing a nuclear Iran, which is going to be the result of the perpetrated systematic diplomatic option, because rogue regime is not going to change its colors. As I said, it will change its tactics, but not its spots.
Okay. Again, the clock is ticking, but I would like to invite again our colleague Bob Hunter, if you would like to make a comment at this point, and then turn to Don Wallace to make some final comments.
Yeah, 3 points. The JCPOA trammeled Iranian nuclear weapons program, at least for a period of time. Going away from it, refusing to rejoin the JCPOA, merely has advanced the chances of an Iranian bomb. The Israeli government worked very hard for that situation, and the whole world may live with that. The Iranians and the Israelis giving us a nuclear Iran. Well, that's the fact. The intervention in the United States politics. We live with it every day, number one. Number two, in terms of negotiating with Iranians, I want to quote you something. Let me turn my head a little bit. You don't make peace with friends, you make it with very unsavory enemies. That was Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated by a right-winger for wanting to make peace. Okay, that's not an American saying that. That was a prime minister of Israel, a man I happen to know, and had the opportunity at a lower level to work with. Number three, I think one thing that everybody in the Middle East, all the people have to understand, is the United States is now looking, I think almost across the board, of Republicans and Democrats of the most serious people who have a global perspective, in terms of competition from two big powers, China and Russia. And it's often said you don't want to fight two front wars. That's what it is. We have one front war now. We're at war with Russia now, even though it's done kind of indirectly. But you certainly don't want to fight a three front war. And the ambition of most people in the United States foreign policy community, and certainly of the American people, is not to have any more wars in parts of the world where we don't have an interest directly at stake or we're being attacked. We don't want to get dragged into a war with anybody else in the Middle East, including Iran. And it is, comparatively speaking, with what we're facing today in Russia, in which we believe we're going to be facing with China, what's happening with regard to Iran is small beer. And we'd like to get it behind us. And if that means going forward with the JCPOA with controls over Iran in terms of a nuclear policy and doing what else we can do, that's the direction the United States is going in. And despite all of the efforts that are made to keep us engaged in following the desires and the policies of individual local states, it's changing. It's changing. As I said before, American support for Israel's security is evergreen. That's not going to change. But there is a growing reluctance on the part of a lot of Americans, including a lot of Americans highly sympathetic to Israel, not to get dragged into a war with Iran.
Thank you, Bob. And Professor Don Wallace, final words.
Yonah, I want to thank you again for bringing together these very informed panelists. I think we've been exposed to some true insights. I think we've exposed to sufficient insights that most of us, I think, and most of your listeners will be able to form their own judgments. So I want to thank you for that, Yonah, and thank everyone as well.
Thank you.
Yonah, you have to say goodbye, I think, or someone must say something.
Well, I really pray and hope for better days and for peace in the Middle East. And so we'll see what's happening now with NATO summit, as well as the discussions in the coming weeks and the trip of President Biden in the Middle East. And I think we'll be a little bit wiser how the future may look. So with that, goodbye.
Thank you,
We have
Yona.
some audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Everyone,
Bye.
goodbye.